Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is using overbuilding plus curtailment to achieve 100% clean electricity. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, as part of our 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. Before I pass this over to our host and our guest speakers, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there, and you can also click on that to expand the webinar console. One of the things you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit questions and comments. We encourage you to do that. We'd like to hear from you. And we'll be saving about 15-20 minutes at the end of our presentations for Q&A with the audience. So please do type your questions and comments in as you think of them. Don't wait until the very end, and we'll get to as many as we can. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email probably this afternoon or tomorrow at the latest with a link to the webinar recording. The slides will also be posted, and you can find all of those materials posted on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to CESA Executive Director Warren Leon. Warren, over to you.
Hey, thanks very much, everybody, and thanks to everyone for joining us for today's webinar. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance as part of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. CESA is a membership organization composed of public agencies across the country, primarily state agencies, and you can see our members up here on the screen, and we engage in a variety of activities on a range of topics through CESA. And one of the activities we are doing is the 100% Collaborative, which is an initiative for those states that have adopted 100% clean energy goals, or for states that are considering adopting 100% clean energy goals in the future. And those states meet together to figure out what joint challenges they have, what strategies they should be using to overcome those challenges. And we also present information for a wider range of stakeholders and for the general public, including webinars like the one today. And we have a monthly newsletter which talks about news related to 100% clean energy at the state level. If we could go to the next slide. Today's topic is focusing, as you heard, on the strategy of overbuilding plus curtailment. This is a really interesting strategy and an interesting approach to dealing with one of the essential issues related to going towards 100% clean energy, and that is, how do you address the fact that some clean energy technologies, such as solar and wind, have variable generation, with generation ramping up and down based on the availability of the resource? And folks have talked about different ways to address that variability, including things like high use of demand-side management, or retaining some variable generation, such as natural gas peaker plants, or going heavily into energy storage. Well, in Minnesota, they had a grant from the Department of Energy, the Minnesota Solar Pathways Grant, and they were looking into how could they move towards high penetration of clean energy in Minnesota and in the MISO region. And as part of that, what they did is they explored the concept of overbuilding and curtailment. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I think you'll find it really interesting, and their findings very suggestive. And we're going to have two speakers, Marc Perez, who's going to talk about the study that he worked on dealing with overbuilding plus curtailment. And then Brian Ross is going to talk about some of the issues involved with implementing such a strategy and citing the sorts of facilities you would need to cite to implement it. I'm going to introduce Marc now. He's then going to speak, and then I will introduce Brian. So Marc Perez is a senior researcher and consultant at Clean Power Research in California, where he manages R&D activities in the areas of high penetration renewables and solar potential assessment using remote sensing data. Marc serves on the board of the American Solar Energy Society and the expert boards of the International Battery Energy Storage Alliance and Joint Forces for Solar. He's a trained scientist with 15 years experience in the solar PV sector across multiple roles. He holds a PhD and 2 master's degrees in Earth and Environmental Engineering from Columbia University. Marc, you're on.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Warren. Without further ado here, thank you for this opportunity, by the way. Always thrilled to speak to audiences about this work that we've been doing for a number of years, and particularly this Minnesota Solar Pathways work, which I think you'll find very interesting and pertinent to your work. So today I'll be speaking about using overbuilding and curtailment to achieve 100% clean electricity. Specifically, I'll be talking about this case study where we employed this model across the MISO region, and I'll touch upon some of the other work that we've done using similar models to balance the different strategies that will help us achieve 100% clean electricity without breaking the bank. So here we go. So why investigate 100% renewables in the first place? Well, there's the environmental prerogative and the socioeconomic prerogative, both prerogatives of which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. There's, of course, the resource availability. There's 1,200 times more continental solar resource available and 7 times more wind resource available on the continents than global primary energy demand. How do we investigate 100% renewables? Well, the non-dispatchability that Warren touched upon of energy, of this renewable variable energy supply creates novel energy and power balance dynamics that need to be addressed. And this changes the paradigm from the existing energy, the existing paradigm of meeting load, which relies upon essentially dispatchable resources for the most part. Enter the CPT model. This is the Clean Power Transformation model that we developed in the context of the Minnesota Solar Pathways project. This model identifies optimized portfolios of solutions, including storage, geographic dispersion of renewable resources, dispatchable backup, and renewable hybridization in order to minimize cost. Essentially, it seeks to see how we can actually meet load 24/7, 365 firmly with high levels of renewables, specifically these variable types of renewables. Interestingly, the solar and wind resource have very different spatial and temporal characteristics across large spatial regions. How does this affect cost? So enter MISO as a case study. Pictured at the left is the MISO region. And what you're looking at here is the wind capacity factor as a heat map. Red is higher capacity factor, blue is lower. So there's a lot less wind in the southern part of the MISO region near the Gulf of Mexico than there is upwards towards Canada and the Dakotas. And if we go back one, this is the solar capacity factor. And it's, as you can see, it's a lot hotter in the south, or a lot sunnier in the south than in the north and the Great Lakes region. So the two resources are spatially decorrelated. What value does a large interconnected region deliver in terms of reduced energy costs relative to smaller subregions? Of course, if you start to increase the resiliency of smaller subregions, you have more resiliency, and that has cost implications as well. But here we'll be talking about what are the effects of smoothing load and resource across such a large region, and increasing, buffering the transmission power flow capabilities across large regions. you do get benefits from that in terms of reduced mismatch between supply and demand. Finally, how do the expected prices of system components change the picture? Solar has decreased tenfold in cost over the past 10 years, wind about 7x. You know, those trends are expected to continue, particularly for storage. How do those projected trends influence the build out of these different technologies? So some characteristics regarding MISO: 120 gigawatt peak, 670 terawatt hours per year of demand. Renewables currently stand at 21 gigawatts of wind and 330 megawatts of PV. The geography: there's 3 macro regions. You can subdivide the general MISO region into north, central, and south. There are 10 load resource zones. These are balancing areas within the MISO. The resource is vastly different across these different regions. Let's zoom in here to zone 3, and pictured at right is a 1 year of monthly interval capacity factor for wind in blue, the blue line, and in solar, the yellow line. You can see, first of all, that wind has a much higher capacity factor generally than solar, in this region at least. And you can also see that they have a seasonal anti-correlation. There's more sun in the summer than in the winter, and vice versa for wind. You go down to a more southerly zone, zone 10 down here in the south, and wind, first of all, has a much lower capacity factor. There's less wind resource. At most month-long periods throughout the course of the year, and 1 kilowatt of solar is going to produce more energy than 1 kilowatt of wind, except for in late December. And they're still seasonally anti-correlated in the same fashion that they are up north. So let's examine the influence that these characteristics have on optimized capacity expansion and the costs that result therefrom. How do we optimize capacity expansion and dispatch? So this clean power transformation model that I mentioned before, used across the Minnesota Solar Pathways Project, Reunion region, Italy, New York, and Los Angeles. This optimizes capacities and dispatch of the following technologies. On the generation side, we have wind, PV, and it can include dispatchable generation like gas. It could be renewable gas, landfill gas, something like that, biogas. Balancing technologies, we use electricity storage and implicit storage, which is this concept of overbuilding plus curtailment. And we've called it implicit storage because it has the same balancing effect as storage. And I'll talk more about that in the following slides. The optimization is LCOE cost-based, and 4 scenarios include component costs and characteristics we developed from the latest NREL ATB, which is the annual technology baseline. We have 2050 high and low degrees of technological development and 2025 high and low degrees of technological development. Here's an expansive table with all of these cost assumptions that we made for these 4 different cost scenarios. You can see we have capital costs and operating costs for utility scale PV, wind, storage, and gas that we use in the context of the model to examine what the costs are for different build outs of these different capacities. So these 4 scenarios are run for the 14 different distinct geographic zones, the 10 load resource zones, the 3 macro regions, and the MISO as a whole that I pictured on the previous page. Each region has its own distinct load shape and resource characteristics. All in all, we ran almost 25,000 year-long hourly interval dispatch simulations in seeking the optimal across these 56 different distinct scenarios. So let's dive in. Let's start the story when renewables are small enough in capacity to never exceed load in any given hour. So that's the case here. We're going to zoom into load resource zone 7, which is the Michigan oven mitt up here, with no PV first and foremost, and no overbuild. This is what the load looks like for a given week in July. You can see it peaks in the late afternoon and it hits a trough in the early morning. We increase PV to 5% energy penetration, and we start to serve some of the load. And when I'm talking about energy penetration, an easy way to think about it is the integral of the PV, so the integral of the yellow in this case. If you sum up all the yellow, it's exactly equal to the integral of the load, the black, times P percentage, so in this case 5%. 10% We can add a little bit more PV. We go to 15%, we start digging an even bigger chunk out of load. At 20%, 25%. Now this is the point where PV is just close enough, it's almost exceeding load. So there's not a lot of residual load unmet by PV in the middle of the day, and there's still a ton in the middle of the night. So markets are currently designed to incentivize renewables injecting power with very few constraints. This works until roughly you reach 20-25% energy penetration for solar at least. And this is assuming that the residual load is composed of flexible dispatchable generation, because you can't run a nuclear or conventional coal plant easily to meet this residual. This needs to be something like natural gas or something. And just to flip the script a little bit so you can see the duck curve, this is the same 25% energy penetration, but I've just subtracted the PV from the load so you can see what the residual actually looks like in these gigantic duck curves in the middle of the day. You need something that can ramp a lot, as I mentioned before. This is the distribution of hourly ramp rates to meet this residual. It's plus or minus 6 gigawatts that we need, which is far more ramping capability than we need now, because currently you can just have base load hit almost 10 gigawatts in this region, and then your ramping capability is only 5, 6 gigawatts or something like that. All right, so next. So if we want to push the envelope further, we start to need energy storage to charge with the excess and discharge when the resource is inefficient or insufficient. Let's go to 30%. So here you can see that, go back to 30% here. So here you can see that we're charging when we have excess in the middle of the day, and we discharge immediately when there's a deficit. So right after there's insufficient sunlight and PV production being injected to meet load, we discharge the storage. So 40% can be achieved on an energy basis. If we want to push the envelope further, here we go. Let's go. There's a bit of a lag here. Excuse the technology. Okay, 50% we can do easily. 60% we can do easily. 70% we can do easily, etc. And you can see the residual gets smaller and smaller, but we still need roughly a similar capacity. So let's go to 100%. Okay, perfect. We can do 100% on an energy basis easily. We just need to store all the excess that happens in the middle of the day and discharge it at night. So it seems feasible. What does the storage need to operate like in order to achieve this? What are the specs of the storage? So let's look at the storage duty cycle in order to meet this load, 100% PV for zone 7. Roughly, and the green right here is when the storage is charging, the pink is when it's discharging. We need roughly 41 gigawatts of charge capacity. So if this is hydrogen paradigm, for instance, we'd need a 41 gigawatt electrolyzer. And on the discharge side, on the fuel cell side, if it's hydrogen, 17 gigawatts of discharge capacity. Or if it's a lithium ion battery, we need 41 gigawatts of battery size, essentially. And how many hours of storage does that indicate? Well, it's about 4 hours relative to the PV capacity. It's about 230 gigawatt hours of storage that's required to mitigate diurnal variability. And you can see here, this is the storage state of charge for this same week. You can see the storage discharging at night and charging during the day. Discharging at night, charging during the day, etc. So 100% penetration is feasible. The integral of the PV can be set to equal exactly the integral of the load, but we're left with a big energy imbalance problem. And that's shown here. This is 1 year of monthly interval load. So you can see that's the red curve over here, and monthly interval PV is the yellow. And you can see that there's big energy imbalance problems here. There's a big summer surplus and big winter shortfalls if we size the solar exactly to meet load on an energy basis. So to meet 100% of load on an energy basis, we need about 66 gigawatts of PV. But we have this big imbalance, and this is what the storage state of charge looks like for the entire year. And you can see that it's gigantic. It's about 205 hours of storage, which is about 55 times more energy capacity than we need for the diurnal imbalance. It's about 13.5 terawatt hours. And that's because we need to discharge all winter and charge all summer, basically. And just to show you that the seasonal trend is much, much larger than the diurnal trend, that storage state of charge plot that I showed earlier for the week in July all fits within this tiny little square box in the middle of the year. So you can see that from an energy perspective, the seasonal imbalance is much more important. So how can we solve this? Well, first, let's look at the cost implications. It's exceedingly expensive. Oops. What you're looking at here is a stacked column showing the levelized cost of electricity to firmly meet load, where we have the 66 gigawatts of PV, we're at roughly $2 per kilowatt hour. And most of the cost is dominated by the red portions of this stacked column, which come from storage. The yellow piece is the contribution of this almost $2 per kilowatt hour that comes from PV, and it's very small. We're mostly paying for storage in order to firmly meet load, when PV is sized to meet load on an energy basis. We can optimize, one of the strategies to overcome this imbalance is to overbuild renewables. So we can optimize the degree of overbuild in order to minimize costs. In this case, the optimum happens to be at 174 gigawatts of PV. So it's about 2.6x overbuild. So that means that we're building 2.6 kilowatts of PV for every 1 kilowatt of PV that we need to meet load on an energy basis. So essentially there's a little bit over half being curtailed. But you can see what it does here to this monthly average PV generation. There's no 30-day period where PV is producing less energy than load requires of it, at least in this zone. We have a year-round surplus. Before we had these big seasonal imbalances, now we have no more seasonal imbalances remaining. What does this do to the state of charge? Well, the storage size is significantly diminished. Now we're at only around 4 hours of storage, or 719 gigawatt hours, which is far, far less than we had before. What does this do to cost? Back to this LCOE plot, and on the x-axis here is the percentage of curtailment, which is linked to the degree of overbuilding. So 50% curtailment would be a 2x on 2x on capacity, so building 2 kilowatts for every 1 kilowatt. And this is what it looks like. As we start to curtail more and more, the marginal contribution of cost that comes from storage decreases exponentially, as you can see, and the marginal contribution of cost that comes from PV increases exponentially. And that's why there's a sweet spot, which in this case happens to be at roughly 27 cents per kilowatt hour. So this margin on renewable capacity is what we are calling implicit storage, because it has the same balancing effect as storage otherwise would. And we need a little bit over 60% curtailment in this case at our sweet spot, which you might think of as wasteful, but think about all of the storage that otherwise would be wasted. I mean, the storage capacity is only being used once per year. It's only being fully discharged once per year to do this seasonal cycling. And think about all of the environmental costs associated with battery technology, for instance, that you'd otherwise need. So this is actually, even though we think of curtailment as wasteful, it's actually saving a lot of cost and a lot of environmental implications. So very economical. 2025, low degree of technological development, MISO Zone 7, 100% PV plus storage at 27 cents per kilowatt hour. So let's look at the impact of price. This is kind of our high cost bracket, 2025, a low degree of technological development. What if we move to our low cost bracket, 2050, with a high degree of technological development? Well, first, right off the bat, a 70% reduction in capital cost yields a roughly 70% reduction in LCOE. So we go from almost 23 or 27 cents per kilowatt hour down to almost 8 cents per kilowatt hour, just under 8 cents. I mean, you can see even with no curtailment whatsoever, we drop our cost from $2 per kilowatt hour down to 50 cents per kilowatt hour. So a significant reduction, particularly at the sweet spot. And we haven't changed the optimal amount of curtailment. We've just kind of scaled both the yellow portion and the red portion of the curve downwards. So 2050, high degree of technological development, MISO Zone 7, 100% PV plus storage at just under 8 cents per kilowatt hour. What about wind? Does the same overbuilding and curtailment implicit storage strategy hold true? So let's look at wind. This is what the wind picture looks like for the course of a given year. And you'll see that this is if wind is sized to meet load on an energy basis throughout the course of the year in the same way that we did for PV, no overbuilding. And you can see that there's the seasonal imbalances flipped. There's a summer shortfall and there are winter, spring, fall surpluses. So it has the opposite seasonality. Overbuilding also eliminates these long drawdowns. If we overbuild wind to the optimal point, which in this case happens to be 2.7x, so 2.7 kilowatts of wind for every 1 kilowatt of wind that we need on an energy basis, and we have a year-round surplus as a result. What does this do to cost? This is what the optimization curve looks like for wind, also in 2050. So the costs are roughly comparable to that of PV, which was right around this cost point, 6.2 cents per kilowatt hour. And the same lesson is true. Overbuilding really saves a ton of money, about 90% in this case. So 2050, high technological development, MISO Zone 7, 100% wind plus storage at 6.2 cents per kilowatt hour. What about a blend? Can we reduce costs further by hybridizing these two resources? And remember that because of the seasonal anti-correlation effect, adding these two resources together can have a net flattening effect on the aggregate resource. So can this be leveraged to reduce costs further? Wind plus PV. So let's optimize the relative capacities of wind and PV and see what we get. Well, it's true. We reduce the cost about 50% relative to PV alone and 25% relative to wind alone, down to 4.7 cents per kilowatt hour. And we're even lower in terms of the optimal point, the sweet spot for curtailment. And for the stacked area plot, the blue portion is the contribution of this LCOE from wind. The yellow portion is the contribution from solar. The red portions are from storage, and the green portion is from implicit storage, so the margin on renewable capacity in order to reduce these imbalances. To show you where we ended up in terms of the optimal blend, for Zone 7, despite the extraordinary high wind resource and very low PV resource, in 2050 cost terms, the optimal point lands at around 37% PV and 63% wind. So 2050, high technological development, MISO Zone 7, 100% wind plus PV plus storage at 4.7 cents per kilowatt hour. What about a larger region? How do the dynamics change here? So let's zoom out a little bit to the central region, pictured here at left, which encompasses Zone 7. Here, we're marginally cheaper, roughly the same price, 4.6 cents per kilowatt hour. The wind resource is less favorable than in load resource Zone 7. PV is marginally cheaper on the whole, so therefore we end up with more PV. Here we're at 75% PV and 25% wind on a cost optimal basis. So 2050, high technological development, MISO central region, 100% PV plus wind plus storage at 4.6 cents per kilowatt hour. What about all of MISO? Let's expand the region even more. So this is the entire MISO region, and here we're even cheaper, 4.2 cents per kilowatt hour, but on the same order of magnitude. There's a bit more PV in the optimum than in the wind solar blend than we were in the central region. We're at 80% PV and 20% wind, and that's because we're starting to capture really high yield PV zones in the south, in the southern part of the MISO region. So the MISO region as a whole, 2050, high technological development, wind, PV, and storage at 4.2 cents per kilowatt hour. So with 667 terawatt hours of annual usage, this equates to $28 billion of annual expenditures if all the ratepayers within the MISO region were to pay 4.2 cents per kilowatt hour in order to make each of these the builders of these technologies whole at the capital costs we've identified. So what if each load resource zone optimized for themselves? So this is what it looks like. If each load resource zone islanded themselves and optimized their resource blends, the electricity price weighted average would be 4.65 cents per kilowatt hour. And the LCOEs for each individual zone are highlighted in the map over left here. So you can see zone 3 is only at 3.8 cents per kilowatt hour, zone 9 is at over 5 cents per kilowatt hour, and the color is indicates where it lands on the wind PV spectrum in terms of where it was optimized. So that's the weighted average cost, and that equates to $31 billion a year, which is $3 billion a year more than if we had interconnected the entire MISO region. So therefore, it stands to reason that the MISO region interconnection will save ratepayers $3 billion a year. Of course, there's these aforementioned resiliency benefits that you get from making sure that each of the load resource zones are resilient. And this is just a little bit more detail on where the exact PV wind blend ended up if you want to read more into that. The same lesson is true if each MISO macro region islanded themselves. This is what the map looks like and the costs look like for each islanded macro region. 3.88 cents for the MISO North, a little bit more wind, and almost 5 cents per kilowatt hour in the south with much more PV. The weighted average cost of this is 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which is about $2 billion more, $30 billion a year, than if we had interconnected the entire MISO. So there's also savings for these, for the whole MISO relative to these much larger regions. Generally, the larger the interconnection region, the lower the cost. And finally, what about adding 5% new build gas as we did for Minnesota? So let's relax the 100% renewable energy target, or let's relax the 100% variable renewable energy target and allow some flexible resources in there. In this case, we've chosen the natural gas cost, but this could be some more renewable dispatchable resource like hydrogen-derived gas with captured CO2 or something like that, landfill gas. This is just a stand-in for flexibility. And this flexibility could come from the demand side as well. We're talking about supply side flexibility here, but it could be demand side. So in this case, we reduce our LCOE significantly to 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. It's about 20% cheaper than 100% renewables across MISO, with significantly less curtailment, only 17% versus 36% for the entire MISO. And this is even with building all new gas facilities. We're not using any existing gas at all. This is all new state-of-the-art gas. So you can imagine that if the capital cost of whatever dispatchable resource you're going to use as a stand-in for this, feeding in to meet these extreme balance deficits, if that's cheaper, then this black portion will decrease and the cost will be even less. So gas essentially does the same job that both implicit and real storage is doing. It stands in during these worst drawdown periods and ramps up. So the capacity factor on gas is very low. This is what the dispatch with 5% gas looks like. For that same week that we've shown before, you can see the black is the portion coming from gas, the blue is the portion coming from wind, pink is coming from storage, green is going to storage, and yellow is coming from solar. And this red line is the load right here. You can see gas is ramping up when storage is empty. There's no more storage to be drawn upon, and gas ramps up. So it fills in when there's a lack of resource available. Key takeaways. The value of implicit storage is very important. Overbuilding curtailment is highly cost effective in every case. The value of hybridizing wind and PV. Wind and PV hybrid resourcing is significantly cheaper than either alone due to this seasonal resource anti-correlation, even in areas that have a dominant resource. E.g., MISO North still wound up with 46% PV at the optimal point in 2050. The impacts of cost. Nominal technology costs change the LCOEs and relative costs change the technological mix. If we raise the wind cost relative to the PV cost, we decrease the optimal wind percentage. If we raise the storage cost relative to the renewables cost, we increase the implicit storage use. I think generally confidence and consensus surrounding cost will help solidify the planning process. PV is generally favored in 2050. High technological development scenarios drive PV capex so low that even in areas where wind appears dominant, PV is largely favored. This is despite a very strong wind resource in the northern part of MISO territory. The exceptions included MISO zones 3 and 7, where there's such a high wind resource that it tilts the balance despite the very low PV costs. 95% renewables is significantly cheaper, allowing 5% gas or some other dispatchable generation archetype to do some of the work during these very extreme balance deficits from or resource deficits for wind and PV. Can be very impactful on cost and also reduces the amount of optimal curtailment and use of implicit storage. The value of MISO, the larger the region we interconnect across, the lower the aggregate cost. On the whole, this is going to save ratepayers billions annually. The caveat here, of course, is that in our studies, renewables were distributed evenly and co-located with storage in this study. If we bias the siting of solar and wind to higher resource areas for both, more wind in the north, more PV in the south, this is going to decrease the cost even more, but entails a significant transmission and distribution expenditure as a result. Future and recent funded work. The blue zones are where we've run recent studies using this model, the MISO region, Minnesota, New York State, Reunion Island, and Italy. In the near-term future, we have the Atlantic provinces in Canada and Switzerland, and perhaps your region of interest also. So finally, I'd like to leave with 100% of MISO load, 30% wind, 65% solar, and 5% gas at 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That's not too bad. So thank you very much.
Hey, Mark, thank you. We're going to go on to Brian in a minute, but I want to ask a couple questions because I'm a little worried that we are going to lose some people in terms of them not being able to follow your analysis. Could you explain again your definition of implicit storage and why you call it implicit storage?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Implicit storage is the concept of overbuilding renewable capacity and curtailing the excess when we don't need it. And we call it implicit storage because it has the same balancing effect as regular storage, as electrochemical or pumped hydroelectric or something like that. Storage is there in order to take the surpluses of renewables and dispatch when there's a deficit, when there's not enough wind or solar, when the sun isn't shining strongly enough or the wind isn't blowing strongly enough. Implicit storage, by increasing the amount, our deficits are significantly lowered. So that's the overall concept. We overbuild to reduce the deficits.
Good. And then defining high technological development, that scenario, which it seems like you're defining as doing this in 2050 when the technology is advanced and costs have come down. Are you then saying you're talking about implementing all of this at once in 1 year? Wouldn't you have the higher low technological development costs in the early years as you were ramping up to your full scenario?
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are cost projections from NREL. The LCOE is using the future costs, but of course the aggregate cost, if we start now, is going to be higher as we build out. But you know, historically the projections have been conservative, both from NREL and from the International Energy Agency for cost. So my guess is that we're going to end up closer to 2050 high technological development or lower costs. We'll get even lower than that is my guess. So I don't think the LCOEs are unreasonable.
Okay, thank you. And let's turn to our second presentation today. Brian is going to talk about discussions they had of what it would mean in terms of implementing this vision. And let me introduce Brian Ross, who's a vice president of the Great Plains Institute. He leads the Institute's renewable energy market transformation efforts in the Midwest and nationally. He has 25 years experience working with local, regional, and state governments on climate and energy planning, on policy and regulation. He managed the stakeholder engagement and technical committee facilitation for the Minnesota Solar Pathways Project. And through that involved identifying barriers and solutions to deep penetration of renewable energy in Minnesota and the rest of the Midwest. So Brian, it's off to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Well, we're just to make sure we leave some time for questions. I may go through this kind of quickly, but the kind of work that we're doing on that we did on this was really to kind of engage stakeholders around the original concept of the Solar Pathways Project, which was how do we get to 10% solar by 2030 in Minnesota, which when there was some legislation that was passed in 2013 as a kind of non-binding goal, and which at the time seemed quite ambitious, almost unachievable. And of course, now 10% solar in 2030 is practically inevitable. So we've really transformed quite a bit in the last few years. I just wanted to say here that we kind of, in our discussion, stakeholder engagement, we kind of hit all these different people to really talk about what are the opportunities and constraints to solar development in Minnesota, kind of at the time, looking to these two, kind of 10% by 2030 and then high renewables in 2050. I'll go to the next slide. Yeah, the opportunities and constraints that we came up with out of all these discussions, without going into any of the method that we used or the analysis, was we kind of came up with three buckets of concerns that came up from stakeholders, everywhere from the electric utilities, including kind of we had representatives not only from our incumbent utilities, but also from MISO, all the way down to residential consumers, was that there was a whole group of things that related to local and state siting issues, kind of barriers to use of marginal lands, things like agricultural protection, rural character, ecological services conflicts or opportunities, and things at the distributed scale as well. There were several things that related to market integration when we started talking about high penetrations, whether or not our transmission planning was accommodating the kind of futures that we were looking at here, whether there was some ways that we needed to change the planning in order to better accommodate that, and the interconnection barriers associated with those. And then a lot of discussion around project financing as we move to a high renewables future, particularly when we started looking at the results of the solar potential analysis that Marcus went over about how do the SPA looked at this from a kind of centralized planning standpoint, but we don't do deployment on centralized planning. We do it on a project by project basis. What happens when you start integrating the concept of implicit storage into PPAs? What do they look like? How does that change things? We know that it's going to change it quite a bit, but we don't really know how. And then there were some additional concerns that came up around things like how do we address equity issues about how this is affecting different kinds of consumers or different kinds of existing inequities in the electric system. We go to the next slide. Okay, and really the kind of different. I was going to run over some of these specific things. The siting opportunities and constraints really was recognizing the large and growing difficulty there is at the kind of siting level, both at the state and the local level, about land use conflicts when you start talking about large-scale solar deployment. And we have here a list of things that came up for the state of Minnesota, but which are also things that relate to a lot of the other states in the MISO region. Okay, go to the next slide. The next kind of slide is addressing that deployment barrier around energy market opportunities and constraints. When you start talking about high curtailment rates, how does that affect dispatch rules when you have a zero marginal cost resource or resources that with solar and wind that are affecting how you actually dispatch things in terms of those market rules? What kind of changes in transmission planning are there? Future purchase power agreements and the financial risks in a high curtailment future, how that relates to actual projects. Okay, go to the next slide. And similarly, the next slide is about that kind of some of those equity issues, really that relates to the who pays and who benefits question, and the transition costs and access to energy that kind of comes about when you change dramatically the kind of the resource base and generation sources that you're using. And then there were some things that came up around, they have been consistently coming up at the local level around things like decommissioning and electronic waste disposal and whether or not we're addressing those in a meaningful way. Okay, go to the next slide now. And actually, when I go advance 2, if you can, we'll try to go through this a little more quickly.
Sorry, it's going really slowly. Next here.
Okay. Yeah, I did. Mark created a little widget about kind of showing all the analysis that he just showed in the different regions. And I ran a quick kind of a scenario on that widget in preparation for this, where we looked at for just the northern region there of MISO, that resulted in kind of this kind of a scenario for that 2050 build out, where we're looking at about 24 gigawatts of deployed wind capacity, 51 gigawatts of deployed solar capacity in that region. And then I said, well, what does that mean in terms of new capacity that we have to do siting for? That's about 49 gigawatts, because in the region now there's roughly 2 gigawatts worth of both utility and community scale solar, which doesn't show up in the MISO numbers because they don't look at the community scale, but there's an awful lot of it out there. And that 49 gigawatts translates into about somewhere between 350 and almost 500,000 acres of solar development that's needed in order to meet this deployment scenario for implicit storage. Now, 500,000 acres of land sounds like a lot, of course, and it is a lot. Over the region, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the total land area. So it's actually not that much land we're working with, but almost all that land will not be uniformly distributed across the area, but it will instead be clustered where there are things like transmission assets and ability to have less conflict with solar. With other land uses. Okay, go to the next slide. And kind of doing that in the context of how we do siting in Minnesota. We looked at it in Minnesota. The state has siting authority over everything that is larger than 50 megawatts for solar. There's a different threshold for wind, but we'll just focus on the solar question right now. And things that have come up in that 50, what the state has been looking at, that has been problematic in some of the siting that they've done, even today at the relatively low levels of solar penetration we see at the utility and community scale, where prime farmland, there's a prime farmland exclusion rule for power plant generation that has come up as a siting barrier about what do we do, how do we avoid prime farmland, what are the circumstances around that. There's a host of questions around natural resource and water quality protections when you start deploying solar at that scale that came up, and we were not kind of a great deal of uncertainty about whether we're creating an asset or we're creating a liability. And then, of course, consideration of local standards and community inputs. Now, anything below 50 megawatts in threshold is exclusively a local siting authority where the local governments have control, and they have their own set of policies and priorities, such as a lot of these counties have protect agriculture on a land use basis because it's their primary economic base. And so how do we address the integration of solar with agriculture in a way that creates a mutual benefit between them rather than conflict? Okay, go to the next slide. We had a number of kind of things we looked at, such as how do we develop on areas that are difficult to develop or where solar may be good. Out of this project, out of the Solar Pathways project, we actually had a whole study that came out of it about bright fields. How do we actually address this in Minnesota and put solar on closed landfills? And there's some very interesting results around that. And can we get to scale where we can get the number of acres of development in order to kind of meet our solar deployment goals? Okay, go to the next slide. We also had some similar kind of questions, and I was going to dive just a little bit deeper than this, but I'm going to probably run through these slides a little more quickly, since we have at least a few minutes left for questions. And that is the integration of solar and natural resources, or ecological services, as we kind of talk about this from a land use standpoint. And we had actually a partnership discussion where we convened around 15 natural resource advocates, agencies, and stakeholders over several meetings, developed 5 use cases for how solar and natural resources might actually work together and create assets rather than barriers. Because right now the perception is that you do solar development, you're in conflict with natural resources. Can we flip that equation and say, we'll develop this and site these things in a way that we can create an asset? And is there scale in those assets that we're creating to get to the kind of scale where we could, over the MISO North region, reach 500,000 acres of solar development? Okay, go to the next question. The next slide, sorry. And the 5 use cases in the next slide that we looked at that all achieved in some all achieved the kind of scale that we wanted to get to was doing solar as a drinking water protection strategy in nitrate contamination areas, in the drinking water protection, wellhead protection areas. We also looked at where solar with appropriate site design and siting could actually provide surface water protection in impacted watersheds and serve as an infiltration basin or buffer. We looked at carbon sequestration and soil restoration, where you're doing solar and also doing ground covers that are going to be sequestering soil or carbon in the soil and ultimately improving soil health on that site, so it could be returned to agriculture. We looked at habitat buffers and restoration of function around core habitat areas, where again you would build in the habitat opportunity into the solar development as a function of to kind of co-locate those two uses, as well as some growth management opportunities that we looked at, where you put solar on the edge of communities in order really to protect the rural community outside of those areas. Okay, and here, let's see. Yeah, go to the next slide. That'll work. And the one out of those 5 use cases that came up as the biggest slam dunk, in Minnesota anyway, in the near term, was the drinking water supply area, where we actually calculated that there were approximately 120,000 acres of drinking water supply area, wellhead protection areas that were currently in corn and soybeans. One of our environmental organizations had already done this calculation, and so we kind of knew it could come to scale. And really, we mapped those out, kind of where those areas are, and looked at whether or not we could move ahead with projects where we would be deploying solar in these areas in order to get to that kind of 100,000 acre kind of deployment scenario. And there were some other limitations to it, obviously, in terms of where these things are located in transmission access. But this is a pathway that we're actually proceeding down now as a result of the Solar Pathways work, to try to say, can we get to these large-scale deployments in a siting basis and create amenities through co-location of these sites with other kinds of uses. And then go to the next slide is my final slide, where we also are looking into the surface water question, where we're looking at whether or not we can calculate surface runoff coefficients to document that solar with appropriate ground cover can actually be a green infrastructure amenity in those areas, for instance, that have impaired waters or total maximum daily load, TMDL numbers that where you need to kind of limit sedimentation or other kinds of impacts to these waters. We got funded a DOE project called the PV Smart project, where we're documenting this, and this is a 3-year study that's underway that kind of came out of the concepts we talked about. So I rushed through that. I left a few minutes for questions.
Hey, thanks very much, Brian. Just for folks on the line to know, we're going to go over 10 minutes till 10 minutes after the hour for those of you who are able to stay and listen to questions. And I have some that came in both for you, Brian, and for Mark. So Brian, it looks like you did a pretty elaborate analysis of what the barriers would be to implementing this overbuilding scenario and ways to overcome it. At the end of the day, did you end up feeling, hey, this could work, let's try it? Or did you end up feeling this is a nice exercise on paper, but it could never happen?
Well, the barriers we really dove into first were the kind of the siting issues, and I was very encouraged by that because we actually found ways to address almost all of the siting barriers and create amenities with the co-location of solar. The bigger question, I think, that hasn't been looked at in a comprehensive way is the transmission planning issue and the kind of remuneration issue. In other words, how do you restructure PPAs to make the system, the centralized system that we've been modeling, work on a project-by-project basis in a way that's going to allow the people with the money, the capital people, the finance people, sufficient levels of risk as we kind of move into a new realm of how we structure PPAs in order to make those projects kind of pencil. And I think that's a real challenge that I think there's a lot more discussion that we need to move into on both those issues.
Yeah, just so you know, there are a lot of questions that came in on that last point. Here's for either of you. To what extent does this whole overbuilding scenario depend on a very serious and large-scale investment in long-distance transmission?
I can handle that one to some extent. I think this strategy works no matter what the spatial scale, which is what we tried to show a little bit in this MISO work by contrasting the results within each load resource zone to the MISO as a whole. You do get savings the larger the region, which requires more transmission, but this is an effective strategy from the scale of a single home to a community, a distribution feeder. This same overbuilding strategy works. It's just you need less. The wider the area, the less you need it, because you're starting to smooth load and smooth the resource. But it's even on the effect of a home, actually, this overbuilding strategy has been in use by the off-grid solar people since the 70s. If you have an off-grid house and you're constrained, you don't have the load to use as an infinite battery, you're going to need to do overbuilding, essentially. So, this is a strategy that's useful no matter what the scale.
Good. Here's another question for you, Mark. And that is, in your analysis, how sensitive was the analysis of overbuilding and curtailment to large and long multi-day black swan weather patterns that you don't normally get? Some case where you assume there's a multi-day dip in generation from both solar and wind at the same time over a large area.
Not that sensitive, and we in this project we only looked at 3 years. We looked at, I think, 2014, 15, and 16, which covered, I think, a polar vortex period during that time. Forget which year exactly, but it changes marginally the amount of optimal overbuilding, but not by too much, because once you go over 1.5x. 1.5 kilowatts per kilowatt that you need on an energy basis, you really remove most of these multi-day periods, and you're only dealing with the seasonal and very long-term stuff afterwards.
Yeah, and I would add to that we do hear questions about whether or not the kind of extreme events are handled by this, but I have to note, to some extent, the existing system doesn't handle those events either. We have to put it into context. You never plan for anything to address the kind of absolute worst circumstance. You always recognize that at some point you're going to have to do things like ask people to dramatically curtail or forcibly curtail demand side in order to kind of address these things. And that's the kind of situation we've always used, and it probably will continue, whether we take a kind of overbuilt scenario or not.
Good.
Yeah, exactly. What it is sensitive to is this seasonal imbalance thing is going to change with electrification, and that's something we looked at in the Minnesota portion of the work. Once you electrify heating, to a large extent, it's going to add a ton of bulk in the winter, and there you're going to need more overbuilding and more wind, which is what we saw in the case of Minnesota. So the balance point between wind and PV is going to be a bit closer to the wind side because you produce more wind in the winter than in the summer, vice versa.
Okay, and that was actually a question that several people wrote in about. The scenarios you were presenting made assumptions that there would be significant electrification of things like transportation and thermal uses.
Not for the MISO work, but for the Minnesota work, yes. We looked at transport electrification and domestic hot water and space heating electrification. And the electric vehicle stuff is going to add a lot of capacity constraints. That's going to be distribution system impacts for sure. But it's not like people are driving a lot more or using a lot more transport in the summer relative to the winter. It's not it doesn't change the seasonality of the mismatch. Heating does, because heating all happens in the winter. So that starts to change this long-term balance question significantly, which pushes you towards more wind than solar.
So
yeah, and I just wanted to add to that we when we looked at using those kind of dramatically expanded electrification issues in the Minnesota study, people like me were really disappointed in how little opportunity there was from the standpoint of flexible load to mitigate for things. It actually, Mark, if I'm remembering, it only had like at most in a rather heroic set of assumptions about flexible load, it only had like a 10% impact on the cost.
Yeah, and that's because a lot of the cost comes from these longer timescale imbalance things. You can shift electric vehicles significantly, but it's on a diurnal basis, or multi-day max. So it's not having a huge impact on these longer term, imbalance things, which start to become much more important as we push the envelope on renewable penetration.
Great. So, Brian, I wanted to ask about the conversations with stakeholders and your sense about how far in the future it would be when folks really had to take seriously this overbuilding and curtailment strategy. What I mean by that, you were identifying some uses of solar that make a lot of sense in Minnesota for a variety of reasons. At the moment, you're not at 10% of solar, so you're not at these extreme cases where there would be significant curtailment of solar generation. How far can you go before people really have to start confronting, do we want to go down this overbuilding and curtailment scenario?
Well, that's a great question, because when we look at our current build-out scenario, we think that in Minnesota or in the Midwest, we think that we can get to that 10% kind of solar by 2030 without too much problem. But it's going to require a build-out that is 4 times what we've seen so far, and the kind of that doesn't reach that overbuilding scenario yet. There's an awful lot of change that has to happen if we want to get to the overbuilding scenario, and a great deal of kind of recognition for both solar and wind we talk a lot about in my world a lot about the social license to operate that needs to be developed as a land use for this development that needs to happen, so that state and local governments can kind of recognize this as a needed thing. Not that every project needs to go ahead without question, but that social license is something that we need to talk a lot about, because we need to do 10 times the amount of solar and wind that we have now in order to kind of really get into that overbuilding kind of scenario. So it is out a ways. If we build out at the projected rates and even accelerate those in the next 10 years, we're not yet going to be getting to the overbuilding kind of level of integration. So we are talking about kind of we'll have enough that will start to address overcapacity issues and curtailment issues, even at 10%. Let me just emphasize that. But that's going to be limited to just a few months for both the solar and the wind resource. However, if you want to talk about the kind of level of scale at the 2050 level, yeah, we have a ways to go before we're going to see that kind of curtailment.
Okay. Well, I am going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to have some famous last words, anything else you want to say that you haven't had a chance to say. And this last question is from Mark. This came in from a couple of people, basically saying, look, with the cost trajectory we've been on energy storage, especially battery costs, is it possible that the cost of batteries will come down significantly enough that we could rely on them more and overbuilding less?
That's a great question, and one that we did address that you can kind of see in the results here. The problem is that solar particularly and wind also are also decreasing really rapidly, and so the relative ratio between those two things isn't going to change that much, right? I don't see it changing that much. But yeah, you're right. Storage is going to come way down, and the cost projections for lithium ion storage are incredibly low. They're lower than, or they're on par at least with pumped storage hydroelectric, which is the cheapest, and most widely implemented storage globally for grid scale energy storage at least. So it's going to be cheaper than that, and even despite that cheapness, solar and wind are just going to be so cheap that the balance point isn't going to change that much. So these strategies are still going to be really heavily implemented, I think.
Good. So what is something that you haven't had a chance to say that you would like to say, and the last things you want to leave in people's minds as we come to the end of the webinar? Brian, do you want to go first, and then Mark, you could go second?
Okay, well, and hopefully I won't be stealing Mark's point, but to me, one of the kind of simple lessons out of this whole analysis, both the one that was done for Minnesota as well as the MISO analysis, is that the long-term storage question that we continue to hear, and you can read the literature and it still comes up even today over and over again, we got to solve the long-term storage issue. It's been solved. We don't know for sure if it'll be implicit storage, but if it isn't something else, we have implicit storage. Maybe we'll come up with some, and there's been some talk about different kinds of long-term storage opportunities that have great cost potential to come down dramatically in price and maybe change this equation. But if those don't happen, we can use the overbuilding and the implicit storage kind of concept to solve that interseasonal question. And really, the main questions we have are about deployment, integration, and how that happens within our current kind of market rules and market systems, rather than trying to figure out the long-term storage question. We can kind of set that aside and not worry about it.
Great, thank you. And Mark?
I was going to say a very similar thing to what Brian just said. But no, I agree. Implicit storage is really, it does the same thing as storage. So storage is going to need to come down incredibly in cost in order to compete with implicit storage. That is the long-term storage essentially. And it's way cheaper, both from an economic perspective and I think an environmental perspective as well. And I'd just like to add, we have on this siting issue, we have a big paper going out pretty soon by the end of the year, probably in Solar Energy Journal or one of the other journals, about siting and how much land use in the context of all the other existing land uses for every state in the country. So look forward to sharing that with all of you.
Hey, great. Thank you very much to both of you for excellent presentations. And thanks to you and to our audience for your patience on a day when we had more technical problems than we normally do with our webinars. I hope folks will come back and listen to future webinars of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. You could see on the screen some that are coming up just right around the corner here. We appreciate your taking the time and spending it with us today. This webinar will be on our website, and we also encourage you to read the reports and papers that undergird this research. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.